Hello, everyone. Welcome to Read with Rhys. We're going to be talking about persuasion today, and I'd like to introduce my special guest. Please go ahead.
Hi, I'm Kate Mitchell. I am a journalist. I'm a columnist primarily. I edit magazines. I'm also a writer. And I've known Nikki for a number of years. She's one of my favorite people. We go way back, so I'm really excited to be here.
I'm so excited to have you on. So tell me, how did you first get introduced to Jane Austen?
Oh, I think it was high school. Yeah, I think it was high school, and it was right around the time that the Joe Wright adaptation of Pride and Prejudice came out. Um, I've always been a huge lover of books, and I've also always been a huge lover of film. And I was really drawn to the film. I really love just Joe Wright as a director. I think he's phenomenal. And Keira Knightley as an actress. And so, saw that the previous adaptation. I'm like, oh, that looks good. And I've always been the kind of person who wants to read the book before seeing the movie. And I'd never read Jane Austen before. I'd heard of her, of course, but never read anything by her. So picked up the book. I think it was a secondhand book even. I think I got it at Half Price Books. Devoured it. It's still my favorite Jane Austen book. I think I read it in like 2 days. Could not stop. I was just like, what's gonna happen? And then when I saw the movie, I was just so in love with the film. It's to this day one of my biggest comfort movies. So that was kind of it for me. And then I got the rest of her books again. I think secondhand from like Half Price Books. I got rid of those the copies that I had, and now my parents got me for Christmas a number of years ago, like a beautiful leather-bound collected works. So every couple of years I go through and we'll reread, usually at least Pride and Prejudice, if not, other things too. But yeah, that was mine. How about you? How did you get into her for the first time?
So I kind of was born into it. My mom
Mm.
loves Jane Austen, so I grew up watching almost all the adaptations of all of the movies before I even read the books because to me, like, I was so young, I didn't even realize there were books. Because I was just like, "Oh, here's these movies," and I just love them so much, and it wasn't until high school that I started reading them. I haven't read all of them, but I read Pride and Prejudice first, and I love it so much, and then in college, I read Emma in a British literature class,
Mm.
and my professor was amazing. He's obsessed with Austen to the point where I heard that he would, like, go to events and dress up, and I love that so much. And Emma, I have to say, is my favorite Jane Austen. I know that's not everyone's favorite, but I just adore it so much. And I'm obsessed with the one adaptation that has Johnny Lee Miller in it. It's
Mhm.
fabulous. But there's so many good adaptations, and I love Austen so much.
I was really intrigued by the Emma that came out in early 2020. Have you seen that adaptation?
I have. I thought it was objectively good, but
Mhm.
I didn't like it as well as the other one because it's so nostalgic for me, and I
Oh,
didn't really
sure.
like all the changes.
Totally fair. One thing I really appreciate, and I do not have the emotional connection to any. This is the first Jane Austen adaptation I saw was the 2005 Pride and Prejudice. So, like to me, even though I eventually went, I think it was just last year, watched the Pride and Prejudice miniseries. Um, I still like. I loved the miniseries. I thought it was great. I'm still like, I'm sorry, that's my Elizabeth and Darcy is the 2005 one. But one thing that I found really intriguing about the Emma adaptation from 2020 is that it felt like such a clear demonstration of the female gaze on film, which
Mm.
I thought is so appropriate for Austen. Because when you
Yeah.
talk about a writer who truly, thoroughly wrote from the female gaze, obviously written by a woman, but very distinctly for women about quote unquote feminine topics and issues and concerns, and viewed things very thoroughly through that feminine lens. Like she did not have that we see so much in adaptations, I think, today, where it's the quote unquote strong female character where they decide to derive their strength by erasing femininity and encouraging masculine traits. It's so
Mm.
the opposite of that for her characters.
Yeah.
And they are still strong, and they're independent and fiery and
Mm.
fabulous and deep. But I thought the Emma adaptation was just so Austenian, for lack of a better word,
Yeah.
because it was so female gazy, and I loved it. I loved it for that
Yeah.
reason.
Yeah. And when it comes to Pride and Prejudice, I'm one of those people where I love both the miniseries and the Keira Knightley one. I think
Mhm.
they both offer something to the story.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Um, so, what was your overall impression of Persuasion?
I thought Persuasion. The thing that I took away from Persuasion the most for me was I felt like it was a time. I mean, so much of Jane Austen works really dig down into like classism,
Mhm.
and the social structure of England at that time. But I thought this one, like the clear classism, and the classist overtones of the book, especially, and one of the things that I highlighted towards the start of the book was talking about how, like, oh, such a distaste for the military because it allows the people who you dare not even speak to before, who would not even dare like look you in the eye, are now rising to a higher rank than you, and that's why the military is so distasteful. And I was just like, oh my gosh, like, just saying the quiet part loud. But I thought that was a really, really fascinating look at it, and the fact that, you know, the contrast of the rising of the lower, you know, class person versus the fall of this family. um you know, I thought that was a fantastic juxtaposition and a good way to examine class and classism in that time.
Yeah. I also think it's interesting looking at it from like the structural nitty-gritty perspective because it very much doesn't feel like a modern story the way it's
Mhm.
written. It's very narration heavy, and the dialogue that we get oftentimes isn't even grounded in a specific like moment. It's just kind of like thrown in there.
Mhm.
So I feel like modern stories lend more to like focusing on individual like moments, and the book more like kind of just carries you through the story.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good observation. On a similar note, I felt like from a technical perspective, lots of really lengthy sentences in this. Like, I was
uh,
reading it, and it was like, I think the first time that I've really noticed, and this could be the case in other Jane Austen
uh,
works too, that I've just never paid attention to.
uh,
And it's been a couple of years since I last read something Jane Austen. I'm due
mm,
for a reread of Pride and Prejudice any day now. Um, but it seems like the sentences were just very, very long, like a whole paragraph that was fairly sizable could be just one sentence. And I was like, man, there's really just not a lot of variation. And that's one thing, you know, as I'm teaching writing to students today,
mm.
is like, oh yeah, try to vary your sentence lengths and stuff. But it's like, she did not always do that. But you know what? It worked. Like,
Yeah.
I was still interested.
Uh, well, and something too that I really take away from this story is how it connects to Austen's life. It was the last book she wrote,
Mhm.
and being an unmarried woman of her age was not the most common path. And so I just kind of feel that lingering angst about wanting romance and
Mm,
love, but you're kind of at this point in life where that's not likely for you. And I just feel like that's so poignant.
absolutely. And yeah, this was published posthumously, wasn't it?
I'm not sure, but I know some of her
Uh,
work was.
I think this was one that was. But yeah, it's that's a very good point. And there is I definitely see that overtone and something being just out of reach. Like,
Mm,
obviously things ended, you know, differently for Anne than it did for
mm,
Jane. But,
mhm.
you know, it's kind of
It's
a
kind of
sense of,
wishful moment.
yes, exactly. It's, I get a sense of wish fulfillment from the author
Uh,
with this story for sure.
yeah. I do think very much with this book, the characters are so interesting. I love how like annoying her family are.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Yeah, sir. Okay. Walter. Like, Walter is a family name on my father's side of the family, and this story is what keeps me from ever considering naming a child Walter. I
Uh,
can't with him.
yeah. I
cannot.
love how he's introduced to,
Oh my
where he's
god.
reading from the book, and then it's like, "Vanity was the beginning and the end of Sir Walter Elliot's character."
And I felt like that was the most succinct possible description and the most accurate description for this man. Like everything about him came down to vanity and his whole and honestly that's I think part of his downfall. Like their lavish
Mhm,
spending and their
mhm,
trying to keep up of appearances. Like if they'd
mhm,
just been willing to like dial it back a little bit, may
mhm,
not have been in the position where they needed to rent out the
mhm,
hall to begin with. That wouldn't have brought Wentworth back into the life. So I mean really like his vanity was one of the driving factors of the story because without it, we wouldn't have gotten a reunion of Anne and Wentworth to begin with. But,
yeah.
whew, buddy, like,
Well, and the fact that everything tanks, like, as soon as his wife dies, I
mhm.
think that says everything.
Oh yeah, yeah. I feel like that's a bit of a like a slight pattern with some. I like with Emma, for example. Not that things tank when Emma's mother dies, but Emma takes I feel like such a parenting role and a
Mhm,
caretaker role of her father, and I feel like such a
mhm,
huge part of her characterization is being that caretaker for him.
mhm,
And I think that's part of what while she is so much younger than Knightley,
mhm,
part of what makes her and Knightley peers is that she took on this at least emotional caretaker role for her father from such a young age.
mhm.
Because and also, have you read Lady Susan?
I have, a long time ago.
That book, no man in that book knows a thing. There is not a single man in that book who has two brain cells to run together.
That's
Like the women all know what Lady Susan is about. They are all like,
mm.
okay, and like all the men are like, and it's just like, yeah. So like the women being the glue and being the ones who keep things running and moving and being the intelligent forces, um, are like I feel like that's a recurring theme, and the ones being like the exception to that I feel like is Pride and Prejudice, where
Uh-huh.
Jane is so
Yeah.
partial to her father, or Jane
Mm.
is so partial to Lizzie's father, and her mother is a part of the family's sullied reputation.
Uh,
I
well,
think that's the
something
exception.
else, that I've noticed is kind of a pattern is so many families with only girls.
Hmm.
That's so common, and I just kind of find that interesting that Austen played with that concept a lot.
Yeah. Did Jane Austen have brothers?
I think so, yeah, yeah.
Okay. Huh. I wonder if she just thought that was an interesting storytelling tool because of how, inheritance and succession worked, and it was just a
Mm.
good, like, plot point and challenge to put in there, you
Yeah,
know?
I think it let her examine that cultural angst that a lot of women felt in, like, a
Mhm.
heightened way.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. So who were your favorite and least favorite characters?
I mean, like I said, I am not huge on Walter. Like
Uh,
he's so vain. I can't like anytime he's on the page, I'm just like, ah, why are we here? Why are we dealing with you? Um, you know, I of course everyone's supposed to like Anne. She's the heroine, and she's got like she reminds me a little bit more of Jane from Pride and Prejudice, and that she's like, oh, she's pretty and she's accomplished and
uh,
she's smart and she's all of these lovely, wonderful things. And so she had so much going for her. I mean, that's not supposed to be as pretty as Elizabeth. And again, I think that's another thing that Jane Austen put into her books is that like the heroine is usually not like the prettiest sister, but she's handsome, but she's not the handsomest sister. But yeah, I can't. So Walter, I don't know. Yeah, I think Anne is such a fun heroine. I also enjoy like the general like the rise of Wentworth and his eventual like coming around to the idea to Anne again after their separation years before. And yeah, I don't know. How about you?
Honestly, I think my favorites are the Crofts. I just love
Oh.
their relationship, and I
Hmm.
think it's almost I think Austen is trying to provide an example of kind of what like Anne and Frederick might be like
Mhm.
together.
Mhm.
But I just love how like they're both working together to like steer their carriage, and the way that she follows him through everything and he respects her so much, and they're just really good people.
They seem like they have more of a partnership than you would find in a
Yeah.
lot of romantic relationships in that era.
Yeah, and there's also the factor that they don't have any kids, which is kind of unusual for the times.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like there's a lot of mutual respect in that relationship that I don't know is quite as common
Mm,
in that era where, it was so expected that women show deference to their male
mm,
partners, um, and let them control everything and just do everything and do what they want. That's not the what we have, and especially I think that's especially apparent because you know um, the Admiral Croft, like he like bosses people around all day, like he handles
uh,
a lot of important stuff, and then doesn't come home and at least from what we see does not treat his wife that way, and
mhm.
that's an interesting dynamic.
Yeah. I also think, how Austen handles Louisa and Henrietta is very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I think they're supposed to be kind of a foil for how Anne is with her siblings,
Mm-hmm.
because her sisters, they either don't care for her or they only care for her so much as what she can offer them.
Mm-hmm.
But Louisa and Henrietta, even though they like the same guy,
Mm-hmm.
there's never any tension between them. They genuinely, adore each other and support each other, and I love that.
Mm-hmm. Um, so what are your feelings on Mary Musgrove?
So she's a complex character, I'd
Yeah,
say.
she is.
I think her hypochondria kind of comes from, I think she's kind of always felt like the last person that got attention. She's the
Mm-hmm.
youngest, with a family where the dad only ever really cared about the his oldest daughter, and
Mm-hmm.
she ends up marrying a guy who wanted to marry her sister instead
Mm-hmm.
of her.
Yep.
And so I think she does it to try and get of attention, affection, and um, it's kind of sad, but it's hard to feel bad for her because she's so mean.
Yeah. I think with her it's a classic case of like this is what like child of a narcissist can turn out to be,
Yeah.
especially if they're not the favorite.
Mm,
Um and so and I think it's also like she's such a product of her time in a certain
mm,
extent to a certain extent because like how much control even if you came from like a perfectly fabulous home life, if
mm,
you were a woman, what can you do? And then
mm,
you've got the being the second choice of her
mm,
husband, the second choice at best of her father.
mm,
Like there's nothing she can do on her own to improve her situation. And so she does all this attention seeking. All this attention seeking behavior. I think that's just like I said, part of a product of her time. I don't know. I
mm,
think she is a more maligned than I think is necessarily appropriate. But I
mm.
say that as somebody who also feels like Lady Macbeth it gets too much crap.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, because I think she's not personally suited for the life that is the only life she could have, being
Mhm.
a mom and everything. That's really overwhelming for her, and all she has really is her station.
Mhm.
I think that's why it's so important to her.
I think it's interesting reading these older texts through a modern lens
Mhm,
because when you examine especially women, but
mm,
characters who are potentially neurodivergent,
mhm,
who are potentially LGBTQ plus,
mhm,
like characters who are women who are working against these societal structures that are inherently built to work against them.
mm.
Um, seeing like understand their motivations seem very different today, I think, than they did at the time that the book was released.
Mm,
You know.
absolutely. Um, yeah, and I have to say, Anne and Frederick aren't like my favorite couple in
Mhm.
Austen, but I do like that second chance kind of romance where they still have, they never stopped having those feelings and then they come back together and everything. I think that's really
Mhm.
sweet.
Mhm.
Um, but
There's an air of fate to it, you know?
yeah.
Mhm.
And speaking of their romance, I think the most interesting character to try and figure out is Lady Russell.
Yeah. 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 Okay. What are your thoughts on Lady Russell?
I have so many. Uh, because I think at the very end of the book, it's very much trying to push that Lady Russell wasn't necessarily wrong.
Mhm.
Like, it's kind of more favorable towards her, but
Mhm.
there is a very legitimate way to read it that gives you the opposite impression. And if
Mhm.
I remember correctly, in the movie adaptation that I'm most familiar with, it kind of takes more that line where like Lady Russell's kind of the bad guy.
Mhm.
Um, I kind of like feel like she made a wrong decision. She gave wrong advice, but I do feel like part of it probably was from a genuine place of caring because
Mhm.
Anne, I think, represented her mother to Lady Russell, who was her
Mhm.
close friend.
Mhm.
And I think she just kind of treated her as like her surrogate best friend.
Yeah.
And because Anne's mother chose so wrong for herself,
Mhm.
maybe there's that extra one of caution to make
Mhm.
sure that Anne doesn't choose wrong for herself.
Yeah. It's one of those where I think this is another character who, again, when viewed through the modern lens with where hindsight is 2020, that I don't like. I yes, like pushing, like being like, no, 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 don't go with this guy you're in love with. He's not good enough for you because he doesn't have money. And like, and then again, like you said, that like the just seemed like she substituted Anne in for her mother, and
Mhm.
had this relationship that wasn't necessarily appropriate to have with somebody, of like she was supposed to be more of a mentor to Anne and like a mother figure to Anne, not a
Mm.
friend.
Yeah.
Not that you can't be both, but one needs to come before the other, and it's not the friendship.
Mm.
But it reminds me a little bit of how like Amy March in the most recent adaptation of Little Women was redeemed a
I
bit.
haven't seen it.
She has a bit where she talks very, very clearly about how when it comes for women, marriage is an economic proposition,
Mhm,
right? Like this is the only we cannot provide. They could not provide for themselves.
mhm,
They had to look after themselves. They had to look after their family. They could not own property.
mm,
Even if they had children, the children were property of the fathers, not the
mm,
mothers. Like they have no social control
mhm,
at all. So yes, like love is great, but you need someone who can provide for you, because that is the only way you can provide for yourself, is finding
mhm,
someone who will do it for you. And it's one of those where I think she was just far more cognizant of the reality of the time.
mhm.
And yeah, that wasn't romantic, but that reality wasn't romantic either. You know?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Another question that I had was how you felt about the ending
Mm.
and, especially the letter.
So full disclosure, I have not finished this reread of Persuasion yet. And
Mm,
so haven't gotten quite quite that far yet, and I haven't read Persuasion in
a
a
long
while.
time.
But if I
Yeah.
recall, it was Wentworth writes a note and lays out his feelings.
Yeah.
Yeah. I remember feeling the last time I read it, um, loving that, but at the same time, the last time I read it, I think I was a teenager. So grain of salt, because also as a teenager, I was very, very, very into Twilight. Still am very into Twilight, but with like the cognitive awareness of adulthood, where it's like these are not great, but I am entertained by them. Um, so I can't remember the exact contents of the note anymore.
Yeah,
Um,
I'm trying to find it right
like
now.
I know that like it's like so it was he overhears Anne talking about how like men and women, how they love and whatnot, and then so he writes her a letter.
Yeah.
But I can't, like I said, I can't remember what all the letter says now.
The first time was introduced to this story was the adaptation,
Okay.
and it's this amazing, and they kind of changed the way the dialogue happens in the context, but the audio of him reading the note as she's running through Bath
Oh my
is
gosh.
just
Okay,
fabulous.
I have not, again, full disclosure, not seen any adaptations of Persuasion.
Oh,
So,
I highly recommend, the one it has, Sally Hawkins in it,
ooh, I
from
love her.
2007. Yeah, it's gorgeous.
Okay, okay,
They
okay,
do
okay.
make some changes in it, but,
Okay, I
it's
can live with that.
uh and I watched it, I wanna say, like, a year ago because 'cause it'd been forever, and there's so much shaky cam in the beginning, and it's thematically like, it works with the story, but it's, like, crazy.
Yeah, like that. When you think Jane Austen, you don't think. I mean,
Mm,
again, it could be because my introduction to Jane Austen adaptations was
mm.
the Joe Wright Pride and Prejudice. So I'm like sweeping vistas and like helicopter shots over the like the cliffs. But yeah, shaky cam's not what comes to mind with Austen for me.
Well, what they did was they started it with her, like, going through the house and itemizing things and trying to handle all that
Mm.
with, like, a montage, and it was just all this shaky cam as she's walking around.
That would work really. Yeah, now that you pointed out that way, laid out
Yeah.
that way, yeah, that seems thematically really accurate. Like
Yeah.
that could fit really well.
I'm trying to find it still. Uh,
That's okay.
it's just
I
such a
love a
good
good love
letter.
letter. You've read enough of my crap. Like Nikki, you know how much I love like declarations of love.
Ah,
Have
there we
I?
go, I just found it. I'm going to probably read the whole thing because this is one of the best things I've ever read.
Okay,
It's
please,
it's perfect.
please.
I can listen no longer in silence. I must speak to you by such means as are within my reach. You pierce my soul. I am half agony, half hope. Tell me not that I am too late, that such precious feelings are gone forever. I offer myself to you again with a heart even more your own than when you almost broke it 8 years and a half ago. Dare not say that man forgets sooner than woman, that his love has an earlier death. I have loved none but you. Unjust I may have been, weak and resentful I have been, but never inconstant. You alone have brought me to Bath. For you alone I think and plan. Have you not seen this? Can you fail to have understood my wishes? I had not waited even these 10 days. Could I have read your feelings, as I think you must have penetrated mine? I can hardly write. I am every instant hearing something which overpowers me. You sink your voice, but I can distinguish the tones of that voice when they would be lost on others. Too good, too excellent creatures. Creature, you do us justice indeed. You do believe that there is true attachment and constancy among men. Believe it to be most fervent, most undeviating in FW. Isn't that fabulous?
That's so good.
It
It's actually
explains so
better
much
than
of how
I
he's
remember it
feeling.
being.
Yeah. And so in the adaptation, it's like playing the words of the letter as she's running to him,
Oh
and it's
my
so
god.
dramatic.
I love that so much. Okay, yeah, I've got to watch that adaptation as soon as
Yeah.
possible.
Yeah,
Oh,
and
that's
the
gorgeous.
actor who plays Wentworth is amazing, Rupert Penry Jones, and
Okay.
his voice reading that letter especially makes it even better.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I love that. Love that. That's gorgeous. Yeah.
It's it just makes me speechless every time I read it.
Yeah, that's beautiful. The whole like the fact that he was striving and working his way up in the only way that he really had
Mhm.
access to in the classist system of the time
Mhm.
to be able to be quote unquote worthy of her.
Mm.
Like I can't even. That's
Well, and the fact that Austen, yeah, she had some romances in her life, but that,
Hmm.
she never had something that worked out, but that she still had such a keen understanding of those feelings is
Hmm.
really impressive.
Yeah, I think it's I think it's one of those where we were talking about this being kind of wish fulfillment, and I think that
Mhm.
is, I mean, honestly, like, what woman wouldn't want to get a letter like that, right? Like, honestly,
Right?
what person would want to get a letter like that? Gender aside,
Yeah.
I find it hard to believe that any man with half a heart wouldn't, like, completely fall to
Uh,
pieces if his, the object of his
yeah.
desire sent a letter like that to them, Like,
Absolutely.
yeah. But there
Uh,
is, that longing and that want that's so apparent
mhm.
and in such beautiful language.
Yes, it's amazing. And this is, like, coming from, like, an army guy, a naval guy,
Right.
like
The manliest of men, as it
Yeah.
were. Yes. Yeah.
So yeah, let's talk a little bit more about adaptations, unless you have any, questions yourself about the book for me.
Not that I can think of off the top of my head, but yeah, I'm down to talk adaptations because I am, like, desperate to hear what your favorites are and why.
Oh, actually, some of my favorite adaptations are literary vlogs on YouTube.
Oh yeah, you were telling me about some of those.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
they're so cool, and I feel like this was a genre of, adaptations, back in, what year was it they were they being done? Um, like, I think, like, the early 2010s was when
Hmm.
a lot of these went out, and it was so popular. There's several of them, not all of them are Jane Austen, there's some Shakespeare ones too that are good,
Hmm.
and then it's just kind of died out, and I don't hear people talk about it anymore,
Hmm.
which is sad because they're so amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's the Pride and Prejudice one, which is Lizzie Bennet Diaries,
Hmm.
which is, think, one of the first ones, at least one of the first ones, that was done by the group that put that together, and it's so good. I love it so much. The way that they too portray Lydia Bennet is so fabulous, and that
Hmm.
Mary Kate Wiles portrayed her, and she's amazing, and that she really makes the series amazing. And then that same group, I think, put together a different one, that was Emma approved, which is also really good. I really
Ooh.
like that one. But I think my favorite is the Kate Morland Chronicles, which
Hmm.
is Northanger Abbey.
Okay.
Yeah, they make Kate this fangirl which it just, like, suits the character and the vibes
Yeah.
so much,
Yeah, it does.
and yeah, she gets kind of, she starts being friends with this actor from the show that she loved back in the day, and they get really close, and it's so
Hmm.
cute. And then, the other one that I really adore is From Mansfield with Love, which is
Oh.
it's just so sweet, and it's set in, like, the English countryside, and it's just adorable.
Hmm. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
I need to watch some of those sometime. Like, even if it's just like I put it on while I'm working or something like that. I need to check those out.
Yeah, that's what I like to do too.
Hmm. I One thing that I really enjoy, and I guess, like, you know what, when I said earlier, like, oh yeah, the 2005 Pride and Prejudice, technically I think I saw Clueless before I saw that. I just didn't know it was a Jane Austen adaptation. And
Same.
that's one of those movies that, especially once you're, like, aware that it's an adaptation of Emma, you're just like, this is so good. Like, like,
I
even
love
before that,
Clueless so much.
it's so good. It's such a good movie. But it's even like when you were aware that it's such a, like, the way that they adapted it and how
Uh,
they brought it into the modern era
uh,
so thoroughly, and it's the fact that it can fly under the radar as an Austen adaptation versus, like, 10 Things I Hate About You. Like, if you have any
uh,
at all knowledge of The Taming of the Shrew, you know what this is. you
yeah.
know like, that's obvious. There was a lot of those modernization adaptations going on, in that era, but, like,
Uh,
Clueless, I feel like, did it so well because, like I said, there's just, it worked so well in that setting and the way they did it, and it's so funny, which suits the book Emma so well. You
Oh,
know,
yeah, yeah.
it's so good.
It's not Austen, but, I'm obsessed with She's the Man.
Yeah, that's another one. Yeah, that's another one where it was like, oh yeah, if you have any Shakespeare knowledge, you know what it is. But it is very that one's very fun. I haven't seen that one in a long time.
Yeah, I love it, and I first watched it before I even knew about Twelfth Night,
Mm-hmm.
and so then I was in my college class starting to read Twelfth Night for my class, and, like, "These names sound familiar, these events, what's going on?"
Violas are there, yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. That's something that I think is really interesting with, the literature that lives on through time, how it's adapted and how it's, adjusted for modern audiences. And I think it's interesting too, because this is a conversation that's happening in the theater world quite a bit right now,
mm,
is to at what point do we like respect the original intent and words of a piece, especially when updating it,
mm,
when things that have like racist tones and whatnot
mm,
for a modern audience and sexist tones,
mm,
like do we continue to stage these plays, do
mm,
we try to adapt and shift them and adjust them to reflect our modern understanding, do we just stage them as they were originally written and intended to be portrayed,
mm,
and let audiences know that that's what they're going to see, and give them plenty of warning in advance.
mm,
And it's I always find it interesting when there are adaptations. Not that there's much problematic to be found within Jane Austen, besides
mm,
the if you have a broader knowledge of the time, and that
mm,
yeah, there was probably several people in the Jane Austen world who was making money off of the slave trade.
mm, yeah,
Because the East India Company was,
mm,
yeah. um, there
yeah,
was still, even if Great Britain was no longer actively shipping like enslaved peoples in the transatlantic slave trade, they were still profiting
benefiting,
off of
yeah,
the product that was produced by
mm,
slave labor. Um, and so there's a lot of money in the Jane Austen world that almost
mm,
certainly came from enslaved peoples. But
mm,
outside of that, there's not much, contend with, like, with Austen novels
mm,
that would be particularly questionable for modern audiences. But I think it's interesting when we can, one, modernize things and stay true to the
mm,
original messaging and the original story and whatnot, like Emma, or two, see slight tweaks with content
mm,
that can revisualize or reimagine
mm,
certain choices that characters make.
mm,
And it's just like a reinterpretation, but not like a rewrite.
mm,
For example, there was a staging that I saw some video and some feedback about floating around the interwebs of Phantom, where Christine was given a little more
mm,
agency in the story
mhm,
by just like through some visual character choices. Didn't
mm,
change any lines, didn't really like change any set pieces, just made it clear that she was the one making the choice to do specific things instead of having that
mhm,
choice forced upon her.
yeah.
And that modernizes that show a bit and gives her a bit more agency, but still moves the story along in the original plot.
Mm. It reminds me of, the movie Ophelia
Mm-hmm.
that came out. I think a valid, alternative is not tweaking the story, but writing a new story
Mm-hmm.
that kind of shows you that other perspective. I really liked getting to see the Ophelia perspective because in the original Hamlet, she's so like otherized and
Mm-hmm.
portrayed as crazy, and there's so much going on there that doesn't really get justice done.
Absolutely. Speaking of adaptations, to go on a short tangent, I apologize in advance. I am I will spend my life savings, which is not a lot, to see an adaptation of Macbeth that is gender bent fully.
uh,
Because as I said before, I think Lady Macbeth gets too much crap.
mhm,
It's the fact that
mhm,
we just acknowledge, and I think it's sexism, that
mhm,
we act like Macbeth did not have agency, that he was a victim of fate, that he didn't
mhm,
decide to do these things, and
mhm,
these women are, are working against him and pulling his strings and doing like, would we feel that way if the weirding women were men? Would we feel that way if it was you know, a woman Macbeth and her husband her husband was like, no, you should totally do it. You should totally kill the queen. Like, go do the thing. If we were living in a matriarchal world, would we still think, if that story was set in a matriarchal society, would we still think that the main character was a victim or not? I don't think we would. I think we would acknowledge that character's agency in the story. And I think the main reason we don't is because it's very, very easy to look at a story where, you know, for example, Lady Macbeth says, unsex me here, and asks for, you know, to be made masculine so she can go and have it in her to kill the king. You know, when we have these women who are stepping outside of their typical societal bounds, and that leads to the downfall of man, we tend to ignore the man's role in this, in which he came home from his encounter with these three weirding women. It's just like, gonna be king one day, babe. Let's make it happen. Like, take some responsibility, man.
Yeah. The fact that like every woman in that story is portrayed as evil and scheming and at fault is so telling.
Yeah, and I think like I said, I think if we gender bent it, I think we would see those characters differently.
I agree. And then not really an adaptation, but something related to talk about is Austen Land.
Yes! I finally watched that last year on your recommendation.
I love that movie so much. Jennifer Coolidge as the totally like clueless, not Jane Austen obsessed person, but still so sweet. And
I would watch Jennifer Coolidge do anything. She's so funny. She's so funny. No, I loved that movie. It was so fun, and I would also 110% go to that Austen Land park.
Me too.
I am a happily married woman. Send me off, like
just to put on like the outfits and dink around, like that would be so fun.
Oh my gosh, and I loved the like, yeah, it's not an adaptation, but the storyline is so Austen-like, you know, where it's just like, oh, she falls for the lowly stable boy who isn't who he seems, and it's just like, oh, it was so totally perfect.
And JJ Field in it, it was fabulous, and he played Tilney in an adaptation of Northanger Abbey.
Oh,
so
that's perfect.
Yeah, it was really fun to see that.
It's like a little Easter egg.
Yeah.
I'm behind on my adaptation watching for Jane Austen. As much as I love the books, you'd think I would have devoured all the adaptations by now. I have not. I need to do that.
Well, there's so many, and like from different eras. Like the ones from like the 70s are like really stagey feeling. And then we had that era in like the 2000s of really cinematic takes on them, and it's really interesting.
Speaking of adaptations, I am very much looking forward to, again, Joe Wright, the Cyrano de Bergerac adaptation that came out this weekend. I haven't seen it yet. I want to very badly. I actually went to high school with somebody who did the stage version of that movie with Peter Dinklage.
Wow.
Yeah. I randomly went to high school with a couple of one very famous actor and one like actor who's like getting his name out there quite a bit and is like he's also going places, and they're both so freaking incredible. I'm so excited for them. But so like I'm super excited to see. I'm even more excited to see that because after like, you know, reading about his experience working with Peter Dinklage in the role of Cyrano, I am so excited for that movie. I think it looks like it's gonna be fabulous.
Yeah, the trailer alone, like the cinematography looks amazing.
Although I do say it's a little like after a certain point, I'm like, why are we pretending like Peter Dinklage isn't hot? Like, that man is beautiful. Like, he's short, sure, yes, but he's hot. Like, can we stop acting like he's not a catch? Because he is. Like, I'm 5'10". I'm already taller than half the men I know.
I have the opposite problem. I'm so short.
When I got a bridesmaid's dress for a friend's wedding earlier today, they're like, "Do you need extra length on your dress? Are you gonna wear heels?" I'm like, "Ma'am, my husband is my height. No, I'm not wearing
that." And I don't know if we've talked about it, but have you seen Sanditon?
I have not, actually.
Oh.
I need to watch that. I really do. Yeah, I just have not watched it. I haven't gotten around to it. It's been on my list. I've heard great things. Have you seen it?
Yeah.
Okay, tell me your thoughts.
The second season hasn't come out yet, so I don't know where they're gonna go, because the way it ended was kind of crazy. I don't want to give too many spoilers, but one of the main actors was like, "I'm not gonna be in the next season," and it's like, "Excuse you, sir."
I have a lot of questions. Okay, yeah, I do need to watch that. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, it's so interesting because Austen only wrote so much of the story, and so the fact that they're able to try and like construct this whole story is so interesting. And I do especially really like Charlotte. I've seen the actress and other things, and she's fabulous. She's really likable and sweet and has gumption, and I really like that. And they are doing an interesting thing where one of the characters is black, and so yeah, and I think that's I can't remember, but I think that they said that's from the story that Austen wrote. It was kind of like her first time having a black character in a story, and it's really interesting. I think it's worth watching, but I have no idea where it's gonna go.
I'm not gonna lie. The second I watched like the pilot episode of Bridgerton, I got so mad that we have not had people of color playing characters in these historical costume dramas, because I'm sorry, Regé-Jean Page in general, but in costume, we have been deprived.
Yeah.
For
Absolutely.
how long? Because of racism? Are you kidding me?
Well, and it's crazy to me when Brandy's Cinderella exists.
Yes.
Like, we grew up watching this movie that was totally colorblind, and it was amazing.
That I love colorblind casting for just that purpose, because it is truly. I also love gender blind casting for the same purpose. Like, let's truly get like the best people for the role into the role, regardless of color, gender, sexual orientation, like we can like the media that can be produced with that approach, it can be so good. But yeah, like Regé-Jean Page as Duke Simon and Bridgerton, I'm just like, I could have been watching this for years and no one told me. Like my blind spot there was huge. Speaking of adaptations, I read a book last year, I think I talked to you about it, called Longbourn, and I thought it was fascinating. It's basically Pride and Prejudice, but from the point of view of the servants at Longbourn. And that was fascinating. It was a really interesting look into that side of life that, of that time that Jane Austen never explored. It even goes beyond the story a little bit to like Lizzie moving in with Darcy at Pemberton or Pemberley, and it was really fascinating. Obviously it's not as good as Austen, but it was really good. Yeah. And I thought that was an interesting perspective that hadn't really been explored that I'd seen before.
I think adaptations that go beyond just copying are like what is really special, like looking at different angles, different characters, different perspectives.
Yeah, I would 100% love to see, especially after the letter, love to see Persuasion from Wentworth's point of view. Like,
right?
Anytime.
Well, because at the end he does go through kind of what was going on his side. How like he almost like, I don't know how long it was after she turned him down, but like I want to say like maybe a few years later.
I think it was like 7 or 8 years between like when they first split up and when they get back together, right?
Yeah, but sometimes It's so long. But, like, sometime in between that, like, maybe a couple years after she turned him
Mhm,
down, he'd already made some money, and he
mhm,
could have gone to her, but he didn't. He kinda, like, held himself back from it, and he's like,
mhm.
"If I had come, would you have accepted, my proposal at that point?" She's like, "Yeah." He's like, "Oh,"
Yeah,
you
like,
know?
"I wasted so much time." Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Uh,
It's part of one thing that I love about reading romance novels is that
mhm.
it's so common in the romance genre to write from both perspectives.
Mhm.
And I'm just such a sucker for getting both sides of that story. Like I don't know. I don't want what E.L. James is doing where he's going through and
Yeah.
the one is more than any one perspective of
I think I lost you. I can't hear you.
can you hear me?
There, now I can.
Okay. Um, sorry. Well, one perspective on 50 Shades of Grey is more than any person needs, in my opinion. I mean, not to yuck someone else's yum. If you enjoy it, good on you. But yeah, definitely don't need a whole book from Christian Grey's perspective, let alone three. But telling the story from two perspectives simultaneously, that's one thing that I think the romance genre's done a really good job of.
Mhm.
And so you get to see like both sides of the relationship developing and
Mm.
know how both sides are feeling, like while the suspense of do they feel the same way, and like how is this going to turn out is part of the fun of Jane Austen.
Mm.
Having the reading the other side. And I don't know, I feel like she would have been so good at writing the logging from the male half of the
Yeah.
relationship. I really wish we had more of that
I
you
know, I feel
know
like she'd be fabulous at it.
oh, it'd be have a hard time putting that down.
But yeah, the overall thing that I noticed as I was reading this book was how many times she uses the word persuasion or persuaded. Like, it's all over this book.
Hmm.
And she, like, gradually makes this really interesting, nuanced statement about persuasion that I think is really interesting. Like,
Hmm.
sometimes persuasion is good, but sometimes it's not, like, it's
Hmm.
very nuanced.
Yeah. Yeah. I think sometimes it is that you have to like let things happen, and sometimes you got to nudge
Mm.
people in the right direction. Like
Yeah.
you just got to figure out what's better for the situation.
Yeah, and sometimes it's good to, be a little bit more bullheaded, and sometimes it's better to listen.
Mhm. Yep.
Because, like, you
Yeah.
have, Louisa who goes and hits her head because she's being so stubborn 'cause she's trying to show off for Frederick.
That is like yeah, that's the I like that she was so like high energy and
Uh,
just like putting yourself out there like
yeah.
girl. You
Yeah,
do
it's one
you
of
do
those
that.
things where, like, Henry and Louisa are both going after Frederick, but you still
Mhm.
like them even though they're
Mhm.
technically competition for Anne.
Mhm. Um it's not in Persuasion, but the whole conversation about and I can't remember if this is actually in the book or if it's just in the 2005 adaptation of Pride and Prejudice, where like, poetry can kill love dead if it's the love is not stirred enough stuff to handle it. Like if you throw too much at something, it's
Mhm.
not gonna stick. You've got to do
Uh
like judicious about it.
Well, I love how in Persuasion, Frederick tells Louisa basically like, the girl for me will be very firm-minded and, all that. And she takes it to heart and then it makes
Mhm.
her, bump her head. And then Frederick, I think, must kind of come to the realization that, maybe that's not a great thing to be like
Right.
putting at the very top of the pyramid.
And I think he also like that, I think is part of his reevaluation of his relationship to her, and what eventually like brings him back around to actually like to not just loving Anne from afar, but
Uh,
getting in there because
yeah.
he realized that it's just it's not gonna work. And it's
Mhm.
also you can't it's I think it's also the realization that you can't change someone, like you
Mhm.
have to love them for who they are.
Mhm.
And wanting to change for somebody, at least in that way, is not it's not going to work out.
Yeah.
It's bad all around. I mean, for her it was bad physically, health wise. But over time, I mean, you can't maintain a relationship that way.
Mm.
At least not a healthy one.
Yeah.
So.
And there's also the factor when the incident happened, how cool-headed Anne was in
Mhm,
responding to it, and I think that
mhm,
really reminded him of why her character is so good and
mhm.
likable.
I mean, also, isn't Louisa like a fair bit younger than Anne too?
Oh, yeah, yeah. I
Yeah,
think I think they're supposed to be, like, about 18, 19, somewhere
yeah,
in there.
yeah. And so Anne is definitely like far more womanly, I think, than
Yeah.
Louisa. You know, um,
Mhm.
and so that makes a lot of sense. That dynamic,
Yeah.
and it makes Anne seem a far better like partner, especially if we're looking at the
Mhm.
cross relationship, a far better
Yeah.
partner than
Mhm.
Louisa could be, because Louisa is just she has not yet put away childish things, as it were.
Mhm. Yeah, I think when it comes to, Frederick, if he did end up with her, I think
Mhm.
they would have been happy, but there would have always been that power imbalance.
Yeah, yeah. They would not have been partners. They would have, yeah.
Yeah.
She would have. I think she probably would have been fine deferring to him, but
Mhm.
I don't think he would have been happy without having a foil
Mhm.
in his
Yeah.
life.
Uh, I don't know how far you got in your read, but how do you feel about Louisa ending up with that other officer?
Um, I mean, I liked it. I mean, it's better than her ending up with Frederick.
Uh-huh.
I don't know. Like it's
Yeah.
again, it's coming from things from a modern perspective. I mean, she just seems so stinking young. Like I don't
Yeah.
want her to settle down
I
yet. I want
know.
her to live life, but also at the time, like it contextually makes sense for her to be settling down at that age.
Yeah.
And so, yeah. How about
Mhm.
you?
I'm conflicted. We get so many different characters talking about it and
Mhm.
having different opinions on them being together.
Mhm.
I think in some ways they might kind of balance each other out because they are very different people. They're kind
Mhm.
of, um, and I could see them like, from a modern perspective, you kind of do have that awareness that people that are kind of forced together in tense situations kind of bond, and
Mhm.
that's not necessarily the most healthy relationship, but
Yeah, because
that
this
happens.
definitely seems like it's like a bit trauma bondy, and like
Mhm.
a little bit like, oh yeah, so you took like a semi caretaker role for her, like you were there. She's
Mhm.
like getting better from a head injury,
Mhm.
and she's young,
And he's
but also,
grieving his
and she,
fiancée, and
mhm,
maybe it was kind of helped him heal, like, she was
mhm.
healing and being able to take care of her kind of helped him, like, have something else to
Yeah,
think about.
yeah, I think it was a bit cathartic for Benwick
Yeah.
to be there for her in that way.
Mhm.
And I think that is what drew them together,
Well,
but
yeah. I
yeah,
do
it's
hope that, there is kind of a hint in the book, but it's kind of snuck in a weird way where it's hard to tell if it's meant sincerely or if it's more just kind of a flippant thing that that Louisa already liked poetry.
mhm,
And so, I'd like to hope that they genuinely bonded over that because
mhm,
I think from a modern perspective, one of the first things that people really connect with a lot of times is their fandoms and the
mhm.
books and movies that they love. And so I like the idea of them like finding commonalities when it comes to that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and hopefully they'll be, once I the fact okay, like also the fact that his fiance died while he was off at
Mm. Mm,
sea, I think makes things really complicated. But at
mm,
least emotionally for him. But I think yeah, I think the fact that they like hopefully from yeah, and then now that you mention it with the fact that she liked poetry, yeah, that they have like a relationship that even though it may have started out on like uh, grounds actually
mm.
has this is made of sterner stuff,
Uh-huh.
you know, and is like going to be good and healthy for both of them.
Yeah. But yeah, I think that's everything, unless you have anything you wanna add.
Not really, aside
Yeah.
from, I've been loving Read with Rhys, and, you know,
I love that.
I'm excited to one day talk about your books.
That would be a lot of fun.
Yeah.
To everybody watching the stream after the fact, go ahead and leave a comment. What book do you want us to read and talk about next? Thanks for joining us.
Bye.
Bye.